Who's to blame? This time on Poll Hub, the big standoff between President Trump and congressional Democrats has shut down the government for a record duration. Trump wants billions for a wall on the U.S.-Mexican border. Democrats, fresh off the blue wave election in November, aren't budging. So who do voters hold responsible? We're going to look at the polling around this historical moment and find out. And speaking of history, the HuffPost ran a great piece recently on how American opinions have changed, or not, since the early days of public opinion polling in the late 30s. Ariel Edwards-Levy is the author and polling editor at HuffPost and joins us to talk about what she found. So let's get to it. And hi, everybody. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll. Welcome to Poll Hub.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
Build a wall, build a wall, build a... Are we at a Trump rally? The wall has been a part of our political lexicon for 2 years, more than 2 years, and now it is part of our political morass. The government is shut down. Trump wants a wall. Democrats don't want to give him the wall. And there is polling around this. Not as much as you might think, though. We don't have like tons and tons of polls on this. But Lee, when you look at the polling and the data around this, what are you seeing?
I see people are increasingly finding this to be a more serious problem, and they're increasingly laying this at the president's doorstep.
The shutdown being a problem, not the wall.
And the wall's not popular in of itself either, but certainly connected. If you're going to shut down the government, you better have a better reason than building a wall.
But the president's trying to make the argument that there is an unusual national emergency at the border, and so that's not resonating with Americans currently, that argument.
Because they don't feel the wall's there, and they don't feel the emergency's there, although that may be the way out of this ultimately with a declaration of national emergency. That may be the way we get both of these sides sort of yielding, even if they don't want to.
So I mentioned that there's not a lot of polling around this. The Reuters Ipsos poll was in the field up through the 7th of January, and there's news made every day on this. 51% of Americans say that Trump deserves most of the blame for not reaching a budget deal, and that is up from their previous poll, which was right around Christmas time. 32% blame Democrats. What is that likely to mean in the long run? At some point, government's going to get reopened. What do we know from history and polling that tells us what's going to happen with the popularity of Democrats, Republicans, and the president?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, although we haven't seen a lot of polling up until this point, we're going to see plenty of polling in the near future.
Maybe some of ours too,
including us. But there are certainly this is something that most pollsters and most media outlets can't resist. So we'll be looking at both the shutdown, the wall, and public opinion. But I did take a step back in time to see how other presidents have fared during shutdowns. And in 2013, a question was asked by Gallup and asked whether people had a more negative or a more positive impression of President Barack Obama at the time. And at that time, 57% said that they had a more negative impression of him because as a consequence of the shutdown. Similarly, Gallup also asked the same question in 1995 about President Bill Clinton, and 49% had a more negative impression. And Jay, you also mentioned that Charles Franklin had done an analysis of a president's popularity.
Marquette University.
Of a president's popularity after a shutdown.
Yeah, and his looking at some numbers, especially in the 2013, it took a long time for Barack Obama's popularity to come back up.
And as people increasingly suffer and feel affected from this, assuming the shutdown continues, the numbers are only going to get worse, and then the lasting effect will be even longer, presumably.
And there are all different quality polls that will be measuring this, and I think Kellyanne Conway actually started the phony baloney discussion on questions and polling. One thing to look at, many of these polls would have measured these questions before or just as the shutdown had started, and they will be measuring them again now. So regardless of the quality, if they've asked the same questions in the same way, you can at least see if there's been a change.
And speaking of history, we work with the Roper Center a lot. You hear about the Roper Center on every one of our podcasts at the end for good reason. They are the repository of polling data from the last, basically from the history of public opinion polling, which starts someplace in the 30s. So a really great piece in the HuffPo utilized that amazing resource at the Roper archives. And Ariel Edwards-Levy, who's the reporter on that story, but also the polling editor at the HuffPost, joins us now. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
What gave you the idea to dig into these archives to do a story?
So I've been a fan of the Roper Archives for a very long time, and, it's one of those things where sort of anytime something comes up in the news, it's really fantastic to be able to go and look back and find, not only things that have eerie parallels with today, but also just issues that you wouldn't even think people were talking about. And so a while back, I had actually been talking to people at Roper about the idea of potentially taking some time to rerun some of these questions that haven't been asked in decades, and things where just sort of societal norms that you almost don't even think about are very entrenched views and how they may or may not have shifted in the decades since. And it was really interesting to see some things where, even I didn't do this one, but you could actually look at, how many people own this telephone or a car or a radio, and just things that were considered these immutable parts of American society that are now so different.
So you guys went through the decades. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Yeah, so what I actually did was, this was the end of 2018, so I went back and looked at some things from 1938, which was, only a couple of years after the sort of modern science polling really started, and then 1948, 1958, just sort of working my way. And I looked for a couple of questions from each year that sort of either exemplified something about that decade, or that I thought it would be interesting to, go back and sort of compare. So we had things like gender roles, whether you'd be willing to pick up a hitchhiker in the 1930s, and then moving on forward, the 1940s, there was an idea that Elmo Roper, one of the pollsters at that point, was really interested in, which was the idea of sort of one world government, which I think reads very differently today than it did in the immediate aftermath of World War II. One of the ones that was fascinating to me was, in the 1970s, people were asked whether they thought that their congressman was basically honest. And, this is post-Nixon year. I would have expected it to be much lower, but 60% of people at that point said that they thought most congressmen were honest. And, of course, that's something that today is almost unimaginable.
I thought that was really one of the most startling of the findings, because after Vietnam and Watergate, you would have thought, and we certainly have the sense now that was when the hit was on, but also the stuff you did on women and the workforce. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Talk about numbers that have changed.
Oh, yeah, that was actually one of probably the starkest changes that we recorded. In 1938, pollsters asked, do you approve of a married woman earning business or industry if she has a husband capable of supporting her? And at that point, 78% of Americans said that they disapproved of women being in the workforce if they could be supported by their husband. We ran that in December, and 8% of Americans disapproved.
Did you actually?
That's just a huge jump, obviously.
Yeah.
Did you get any reactions to the question itself? Because in a sense, the wording of the question from 1938 just doesn't seem to compute in 2018.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I did think about when we were rerunning it. And, there were some questions that I looked at where, there was language that was been pretty difficult for modern audiences. We did run a little bit of intertext, informing people that they were going to be taking a survey that had questions that have been asked throughout history. So I think that probably helped with the acclimation from extent.
One of the things that you mentioned at the top of the article is that polling methodologies have changed. I think most people would be surprised at how the results in 1938 or 1940 were gathered versus how they're gathered now. How did you, and spoiler alert, nobody used the internet in 1939. How did you try and get these to line up? Because the way that polls were done in the 30s are so much different than the way they're done now.
Yeah, it's a very big concern. And one of the funny things is actually that we have three different ways of conducting polls, because up through the 1970 polls that we used, a lot of them were actually not even done using phones. They were done using in-person interviews. And then you switched, for a couple of decades to what we would call the golden era, I guess, of live phone polling. And then you had ours, which was conducted online. So, I think that's one of the things where it's never going to be entirely apples to apples. And there are two different concerns. The first one is just what we would, talk about as social desirability, that there are certain things that you might be willing to admit online that you wouldn't be willing to admit to an interviewer. The second thing is more of a mode effect question, and that's one of the big things is how you deal with people who don't want to answer the question. And, so if you're somebody who's talking on a phone with an interviewer, you can say, oh, well, I'm not sure about that, even if that's not one of the options you were given. With an online survey, you have to either have a not sure option or not, pretty much. There are some ways of getting around that, but for the most part, we would give people an option to say, oh, I don't know about this. And when you give that as an explicit option, more people are going to take it. So that's one reason that we, I think, have a lot of higher not sure's than many of the previous surveys did.
Yeah, I think I must have been born in the wrong decade, because obviously long hair in the 60s was not as acceptable as it is today. So I had my hair a little longer back then, and obviously this data suggests... Look,
Yeah, which was that a majority of
Yes.
parents didn't want their son to grow long hair, and right now,
I'll take any hair off.
it doesn't really matter given the styles and
yes,
some of
and
the.
I'll take any hair on my head right now. I want to point out, I know Barb has one more question, but you, as you know, I've always thought you are the funniest, punniest person in the polling industry.
No question about that.
And if people want to follow you on Twitter, you will be the beneficiary of what I have certainly been from following you over the years. But this is also kind of a fun thing you did. Not only is it informative from a methodological standpoint, but it's kind of like a fun thing you were doing also to kind of look at how the changes are. So I assume that was some of your motivation.
Well, I just wanted to step back. And was there something or questions as you were going through the archive that you saw that these are attitudes that really haven't changed over time?
Oh, that's a good question. And I mean, there's some questions that I think certainly would have changed less. One of the things I sort of was looking at was questions that I thought might sort of shift in interesting ways. One thing that I thought was interesting was a question that was first asked in 1998, which was whether the advantages or the disadvantages of the Internet are greater. And that was something I was sort of interested in because obviously the state of the Internet looks pretty different, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago than it did today. But in both cases, it was fairly similar. There's sort of some shift, but not enough to say that it's not just from how the poll was conducted. In both cases, there's a fairly even split.
I thought my favorite one before we go was, because I fly a lot, was from 1988. I was surprised by this only in that when you ask the question, do you look forward to an airplane flight as a pleasant experience, something you just have to tolerate, or an unpleasant experience? I was surprised that in 1988, almost 60% of people still thought it was a pleasant experience. I mean, I was flying in 1988. It wasn't any more pleasant then than it is now.
Well, it depends if you're going to the coast
you
or
got,
not.
like little reheated meals, though, which I think must have been the key to making it a really great time.
That makes all
This
the
is
difference.
something
More
you're planning
perks
on
and less TSA.
Yeah, this is something you're planning on doing again, right? Kind of like go back in time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's something that I would really love to be able to dig into more, and I'd love to be able to dig into specific topics. You mentioned the first question on how gender roles have changed from 1938. There's a lot of really fascinating and, in retrospect, very unusual questions about sort of gender roles throughout history. I'd love to dig more into that, into race, or even into more fun things like just sort of the way that Americans see the world around them, the things that they watch, what they like to do for fun. So I hope that this is something that we'll be able to work on again.
Well, we look forward to that. Ariel Edwards-Levy, a reporter at HuffPost and the polling editor at the Huffington Post, wrote this great article. We're going to put a link up in the notes on the podcast, and we'll give your Twitter handle out so people, if they have questions that they'd like you to research, maybe from 30, 40, 50 years ago.
They want to have a good reaction to something.
Or whatever. They can tweet at you. So hopefully your Twitter feed won't blow up because of this in a bad way. Thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Well, I welcome that. Always really glad to talk with you all.
And that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. And as you can tell, we'd like to really thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell this time, providing a lot of valuable information, as they do often, but especially today.
And not just for us, but for the HuffPo in this case. It's worth noting you can go on the Roper Archives. The public has some access to some of the archives there, so you can look at do your own research into great questions from the past. Poll Hub, by the way, is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. That's where we're at. Mary Griffith is our executive producer, holding our feet to the fire. Kenny Marples is our editor, although I think I'm editing this episode, aren't I? Yeah, I am.
Where is Kenny when you need him?
on winter break. So please send your questions, your comments, your thoughts to pollhub@marist.edu or reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter or Marist Poll on Facebook. And as we like to say, please don't forget to subscribe.